I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house was on fire, because it is.
These famous words from Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, a stark reminder that while not so long ago climate change was associated with the disappearance of coral reefs and polar bears in some very distant future, in recent years, the humanitarian impacts of climate change have become very real.
Aid agencies are having to adapt to more frequent natural disasters.
Today, I'm declaring a drought emergency in the state of California.
Scientists say Typhoon Haiyan is one of the strongest storms ever to make landfall.
Cyclone Amphan has devastated hundreds of families who have lost hundreds of shelters.
This is not something for the distant future. This is something for here and now.
Aid workers may not have expressed it this way, but they've been responding to the effects of climate change for years. And while it took some time, humanitarians now see climate change as arguably the biggest threat they face. The trouble is, they don't quite know what to do about it.
This is causing more challenges for people to survive. People will be forced to move. There will be increasing tensions. There will be increasing conflict. If we know the impact of climate change is real, and if we know that there's going to be tens of millions of people made more vulnerable, then we need to be stepping up our game.
But what is the role of a $25 billion humanitarian aid industry in a $1 trillion problem? The size of the challenge is well beyond the humanitarian system. Humanitarians are used to parachuting into crises, but in this case, there will be no parachute big enough. In Geneva, Switzerland, I'm Heba Aly of the New Humanitarian, and this is Rethinking Humanitarianism. I'm flying solo today without my co-host Jeremy Kanandijk of the Center for Global Development. Before we dive into today's topic, we wanted to share, as usual, thoughts from listeners. So we have pulled into our virtual studio our audience editor, Whitney Patterson. Hi, Whitney.
Hi.
From what I saw, the Twitter sphere had a lot to say about the last episode when we spoke to Syrian Dr. Tamam Al-Oudat about decolonizing aid. So give us a sense.
Yeah, the episode received a lot of responses from listeners, perhaps particularly in light of recent events in DC. In the last episode, Tamam argued that it's unreasonable to expect people working to decolonize the sector to have a perfectly clear vision of how to do that. And that seems to have really resonated with people. Listeners appreciated Tamam's humility in not knowing all the answers, calling out the risks of single heroes for a movement, and that one doesn't need a singular vision in order to call out power imbalances. One particular comment came from Stuart Vallis, a humanitarian aid worker. He tweeted, "I've thought for a while that there should be elected representative gender, disability, youth committees of recipients of aid in each response to inform and guide aid decision-making in each context. Could also have monitoring and evaluation role for donors and be included in policy making and panels. It's difficult for me to imagine any kind of decolonizing project without inclusion of recipients of aid in the leadership of change. I've thought for a while that the how of change is the difficult bit, but it occurred to me listening that we cannot yet define the what." Thoughts, Heba?
Yeah, really interesting. And it reminds me of a discussion we had just after George Floyd's murder about the kind of colonial underpinnings of aid. And somebody said exactly that. Arati Krishnan, actually, she said, we need to be very conscious and proactive of who it is who's going to set the vision for this new, kind of aid that we want, and that there may be people who, in very good intentions, go ahead and try to create an alternative without taking into account that they may not be the right people to be doing it. Of course, the idea of representation of affected people in the governance was a theme throughout the episode, and something that's come up in past episodes as well. And it reminds me of an argument that R.B. Bagios of Reimagining Aid submitted to our Future of Aid series around citizens' assemblies, which are increasingly being used in societies to govern difficult questions like abortion, and now being discussed in the context of climate change. Could that be used in the humanitarian sector, whereby affected people then create these kinds of bodies that have some influence over the course of events. So I think there's a lot of interest in the topic. I'm not sure how much that has practically moved forward, given how complicated governance structures of aid agencies can be, as we discussed in one of the episodes on multilateralism. I would say, though, that there has been at least, he mentions panels, at least some movement in ensuring that affected people are represented in that kind of fora. The Global Refugee Forum that UNHCR hosted in Geneva back in December 2019 was an example of that, where you had government delegations showing up with refugees as part of their delegations, sitting side by side with ministers and having that kind of equal voice. So a bit of change in that direction, but clearly a long way to go.
If any listeners out there want to join the discussion, we encourage you to either reach out on Twitter, or you can send us a voice note or email to rhpodcast@thenewhumanitarian.org.
Thank you, Whitney.
Good luck.
I guess I need it because today's topic is a tough one. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration just announced that 2020, as if it wasn't bad enough, ranks as the second hottest year on record. The International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies estimates that by 2050, the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance every year as a result of storms, droughts, and floods could double to 200 million people. In its worst-case projections, the Federation estimates that climate-related humanitarian costs will reach $20 billion per year by 2030, which is almost the cost of the entire humanitarian response sector. The humanitarian playbook just isn't equipped for a mega crisis like this, and it has very little time to prepare. So what kind of rethink is necessary to the way aid agencies work in the face of this impending threat? To answer that question, I'm joined by Paul Knox Clarke, who was, for a long time, the head of research at the humanitarian network ALNAP, and produced the State of the Humanitarian System report, one of the key reports that regularly assesses the humanitarian system's effectiveness across a range of indicators. He also has, interestingly, a change management background, which gives him a particular lens on how institutions think through the way they change. He's now launching something called the Complex Humanitarian Crises initiative to help the humanitarian sector adapt to complex crises like climate change. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thank you, Heba, and thanks so much for asking me on today. I'm a big fan of the podcast.
And joining us from the Filipino capital, Manila, is Donna Lagdameo, the Senior Policy Advisor and Asia Pacific focal point for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which was the first institution dedicated to looking at climate change within the humanitarian context, actually initiated at the time of COP6 back in the year 2000. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And hello, Paul.
Hi.
Now, as is custom, we always start the podcast by asking guests what one weird quirk in the humanitarian sector just makes no sense to you. Paul, what comes to your mind?
For quite a long time, I have been involved in and also surprised by the fact that a sector which is so reliant on flexibility and speed has a kind of policy system which seems to be so stuck in repeating and going round the same argument, sometimes for decades. And also, a system that's so often involved in kind of collecting and working on information and data that's being gathered, has a policy system and has policy kind of made. Often the agenda seems to be more based on opinion than on all the evidence that's out there. So that's the one that I think's weird. I would say that, of course, I've been part of that policy system for, in a small way for years, as you said. And 3 or 4 years ago, I was talking to someone and saying, what do you think the big thing that humanitarians should be worried about now is? And they said climate change. And I said, oh, that's weird. And slightly left it at that. So, that kind of tunnel vision piece is something that I have certainly played my part in as well.
How long ago was that?
That was about 4 years ago.
Oh, wow. That's scary.
Obviously, things have changed since then.
Wow. Donna, what about you? Something you've never really understood about the humanitarian system.
I live in the Philippines, right? So we call ourselves as the country, we are the supermarket of disasters, or the 7-Eleven of disasters. We are open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So that's the tagline, right? So what I couldn't understand since I was a little girl is like, already that the disaster is happening, the typhoon is happening, and everything, all the preparedness work are being done, but preparedness to respond or be prepared to rescue but the knowing that things will happen, but then you prepare for things after the fact. So that was something that I always wondered, even as a child, living in this kind of environment, exposed always in typhoons, etc. So
tell us a bit more about that. Help us set the scene of the reality of climate change's impact in the Philippines and on your life.
A lot of things. So when I was growing up, it was very on the dot. Summer starts in March, it rains in June, and then so we can plan our lives ahead. So it was very normal. It was routine to say, so to be clear about what you do next. But growing up, especially now that I have kids, it's so hard to say that okay, girls, you have classes, you don't need to prepare to bring umbrellas or something because it won't rain because it's summer or something like that. It's no longer like that. It's just things are just so abrupt, so unpredictable. Yeah, that's the term. And then recently, I have to say, you might have heard in December we had 4 super typhoons, one after the other. It was crazy. And I live in Manila, where we're not the first area to be hit by these typhoons, but the wind was so strong and we felt like our roof will be flown away, and we are at the heart of the metropolis. So I think it's scary when you actually live through it, and it's confusing. So hard to have that kind of you need to live in a way that is unpredictable all the time. So and I've seen also how we changed from saving lives. I've seen how the country evolved in terms of preparing and moving people away from harm's way. So now we no longer count the number of deaths, because I think we've perfected the art of moving people away from harm's way. But the impact on the livelihoods, on the houses, on everything else is just dramatic. So I think the shifting of all of these things has become too personal, especially for us living on the ground in areas like this.
And it's interesting that you raised that, because every year we publish a list of 10 crises on the horizon to watch in the year ahead. And this year's list looks at climate change exactly through that angle, that it's no longer the individual crisis that is the problem, because now the casualty numbers are lower due to better preparedness and so on. But it's the fact that it's one after the other. And so you really can't, but you have no chance to recover before the next storm hits. And it's that perpetual cycle.
Exactly. The sequential nature of it, that the concept that, okay, after you respond, you have time to prepare and then you have to recover. No, it all happens at the same time.
And I mean, it's fundamental what you're saying there, because it's rewriting the emerging reality, is rewriting so many of the rules and so many of the things that we don't even know we're taking for granted, about in humanitarian work, about what the difference is between humanitarian and development, when a crisis starts and when it finishes, what we count as a crisis and what we don't count as a crisis. All of those things, I think, have to be open to challenge. And what I thought, Donna, you said there, really fascinating, and I just wanted to underline it, is how do you prepare for things you can't predict? That I think is a really classic, because you were talking about the unpredictable and the confusion that comes into the unpredictable.
I think it's preparing for the unpredictable, but compounded by so many other things. So it's the complexity of it all is just, everything is interconnected. And so I think it's a combination of complexity, uncertainty, compounding risk, and all those things. And it's
a real challenge to everything that we think we know and we know is good practice, because generally, if we don't know what's going on, we look for enough information, so that we can kind of come up with an answer. But the sort of situations you're talking about are the sort of situations where however much information you have, there's so many moving parts, they're moving so quickly, that no information you have will ever be enough. And we have to come up with new ways of responding, preparing for and responding to those situations.
And it challenges our systems totally.
Yeah.
The existing system is no longer viable for what we're experiencing now. So it's not just about us finding ways to respond properly or effectively, but also allowing a system to make it happen, to allow us to do new things and explore new things, because it's a different time, the new normal. And then the new normal will really bring us to different types of tweakings here and there, from mindset to policies to action to what have you.
So I want to get into all of that, both what you've been talking about, Paul, in terms of the need to reconfigure the way we think about planning for the unpredictable, and also what you've just referenced, Donna, on shifts in mindsets and policy and all the rest of it. But just to first understand where we stand, when you say the existing system is no longer viable for what we're experiencing now, how have you seen the existing system react in the face of the threat as it now stands? How have humanitarians been engaging, for instance, in the Philippines in reaction to climate change?
The national policy says that there's a DRR council, you have funds, etc., but you can only use the funds for response if there is a declaration of state of calamity. So that's the system. That's the current system. However, humanitarians, communities, CSOs, Red Cross are all trying to find ways to do things 2 steps ahead of time, right? To be able to anticipate actions. So, example, in the Philippines, we were doing this initiative, and we were talking with the local government unit. Okay, once we have this threshold, we unlock the funds, etc., and we can do the actions. And then the governor said to us, but Donna, if I do that, I will be charged with misaligning of funds or misappropriation of funds, because the system does not allow me to do that anticipatory at the side of things. So it's just not responsive. We are saying, okay, we need to prepare ahead of time, but it's not possible. So there are some areas in the policy that is just giving us a hard time to do that.
And Paul, is that something you've seen on a broader scale when you, you said that 4 years ago, climate change wasn't even on the radar, but you've watched the sector and its performance and effectiveness, both in the kind of more traditional crises that the sector is used to responding to, drought in rural parts of Africa. And then you've watched it as it struggles to respond to newer kinds of crises like Ebola, the European migration crises, the pandemic now, and of course, climate change. How do you see differences in effectiveness and performance?
There's a variety of ways that humanitarians are engaging with the climate emergency. And they probably run along a sort of a scale from kind of the actions that agencies are taking to sort of decrease their own impact on the climate, so mitigation type activities, right through to the response stuff when there is a crisis which has been caused or exaggerated by climate at the other end. And on that, you've got activities around adaptation, which are often sort of resilience type work being done. People like, the Red Cross movement, Red Cross Crescent movement and Start Fund and others doing a lot of exciting work around anticipatory approaches, so kind of getting in earlier to respond, and thinking about actually how do we respond when those things haven't worked. How do we respond to more frequent, bigger crises of kinds that are much more complex and that we don't necessarily have previous experience of responding. So you've got those different things. I think resilience, humanitarians can make a probably quite small contribution to developmental action that's being done as part of government approaches and part of government structures. It's much, much harder to do anything successful where there's weak governments and fragile states, where it's kind of small-scale resilience pieces. I would say it's just fabulous to see that humanitarians are engaging with that, despite some possible problems, because, you know, before 2011 and the Somali famine situation, not doing anticipation was kind of a failure of ambition. But after 2011, and with all of the work that was done to kind of try and get early warning systems improved and work by ODI and Oxfam and people like that, not doing anticipation from 2011 onwards has really been a failure of responsibility. And now I think humanitarians are pitching up late, but pitching up to our responsibilities around anticipatory work. The concern I have is that how many humanitarian organisations have not seriously thought about the response part, you know, have not seriously thought about when a crisis hits and the resilience and anticipation have not covered for that, and there are possibly tens, possibly hundreds of millions of people affected. How are humanitarian agencies going to fit into some sort of huge response for which they're not financed, not necessarily skilled, and not structured? And that is I think that's still, for most agencies, a very big and very open question.
Especially when you take into account the fact that, as you've said in the past, these crises are locked in. It's not even a question of are they going to happen or not. We know that they're barreling towards us, and at a scale at which the world has never really seen, even if COVID is something of a lesson of what these kinds of mega crises look like.
So much so. I mean, this, you know, to use the phrase, this changes everything, you know. All human life on this planet has existed in conditions which no longer apply. So everything is different, or is going to be different very soon, depending on where in the world you live. And it's really important, I think, Heba, that you bring that up, because often I think we think about, or we have thought about climate change as thinking, you know, when the IPCC very carefully says these things will happen by 2050 or by 2100, the humanitarian mindset, which is quite responsive, I know, you know, is to think that means in 2050. It doesn't mean in 2050. It means these things could happen next week. And actually, COVID has shown us that not only could they happen next week, but they do happen next week. And the question I'd have for the big agencies is, if it happens next week, what are you going to do?
And what is it about the way that they are currently structured that, to your mind, makes them unprepared to deal with this?
I think there are a bunch of things, and some of them are well beyond their ability. I mean, obviously, financing is one. And that's much more about bigger conversations around sort of loss and damage discussions that are happening at the COP and the positions that rich world governments take to those discussions. And I think there is also perhaps increasingly going to be some questions around the legal architecture as well. And those are sort of outside what any individual or even perhaps collective of agencies can address. But at the agency level, the first question for an agency is, have you thought about how your core business, how your core response activities will work in these situations which are bigger, more frequent, and are unlike situations that you've had before? So, and there the closest thing is COVID and Ebola that you pointed out earlier. You know, what did we learn from those? Yeah. So first of all, having a think about it, I think what many agencies would conclude when they've done that is that they're probably too international. They probably have very long supply chains. They're probably reliant on being able to move staff and goods around the world rather than on localized approaches, which are not just, you know, an ideological thing. They are good practice in a world where you can't move stuff around, as we've seen in COVID. So they're actually operationally critical. So how do you make your response more resilient, I think, in a what Group URD have called a degraded environment, when you can't fly people around, when your IT isn't working, when you have to do things much more locally. That's one set of changes that need to be made. Second set of changes is around flexibility, and that's something that we saw with Ebola. I think it's something we've seen with COVID, something we saw, as you mentioned, also European migration, is this agency able to go into a situation it doesn't understand, do things it hasn't done before, with partners perhaps it hasn't worked with before, and build it as it plays it. And that has real implications for what kind of data are you collecting and how. It has implications for who makes decisions in your organisation, how delegated and how decentralised are those decisions. It has implications for purchasing and supply chains, how do you change them quickly from one thing to another as the needs change? And it has really significant implications for who do we think we are? What's our role? Are we really the bosses do we own this crisis? Or are we trying to identify gaps and move, be flexible enough to fill the gaps as they appear in civil society response? So that's a few things.
Just a few. Donna, I see you.
It's just a start.
I see you kind of nodding and taking notes. So I'm assuming you're going to add to that list now.
Yeah, I think it's a very long and intense list. I'll add a few points here and there. I think one of the biggest challenge we have is the notion of we actually build resilience today for the risks of tomorrow. So what is happening is we're just addressing and thinking of the stuff that are happening now, but we're not forward-looking enough to really give us that edge in preparedness and plan a response work. What is actually happening right now is just we're responding to current risks, nothing more. And I think we need to move away from that. And even in the humanitarian sector, I think what would be really good to see is how to shift the mindset of really focus on risk-informed actions. Because I think it will help us even deal with the losses and damages. Look at the risks that will lead to the losses and risks that will lead to the damages, and not just wait for the losses and damages to happen before we actually do things. And this is I think something that is high in the agenda of all the global agreements, right? And experiencing on the ground. I think a lot of communities, a lot of governments, a lot of CSO and humanitarian organizations have yet to really change that mindset in terms of looking at the disasters as risks that can be reduced. So I wouldn't just anticipate 4 or 5 days before, just like what we're doing in forecast-based financing. We only have that lead time because that's the only lead time that we can get from forecasting agencies, that they're very sure that the typhoon will actually move in a certain direction. But if we situate it in a longer time scale, then we can actually help do things in advance and analyze the actions that we can take. Just one brief point on the finance that Paul mentioned earlier. I think one of the things that we can see globally is that the humanitarian relief and the funding is paid by voluntary support. I think there's no global ownership on the financing side of things. Unlike, for example, in the climate, and this is where the debate on the climate finance is very strong, because the responsibility is being owned by the international community. In the response side, the financing is owned by the response donors. And so I think that is it's just something that we can see right now. I have I don't have yet any solution or
Well, is there a way of kind of channeling more of the climate funds, which anyway are much bigger than the relatively pathetic amounts of humanitarian funding out there, towards humanitarian agencies who are actually dealing with the damages of climate change?
The problem with our financing community is that they have their own semantics. So climate finance can only be released for climate actions. You cannot have a disaster word when you submit a proposal for an adaptation project, because that's how the system works. So what we are seeing as a common ground that will allow us to unlock all these financing mechanisms is to really anchor on risks. The climate community is highlighting the climate risk side. The disaster community is also in the risk side. Now, if we put our narratives in the risk, if we do that, actually it's something that we're seeing as we're able to connect in terms of accessing finance in the climate side. So a clear example is what recently was approved by the Green Climate Fund in the Philippines. The first GCF project in the Philippines was about enhancing the hydromet office and building their capacity in impact-based forecasting, which is essentially will help us beef up our in preparedness actions on the ground and allow us to do anticipatory action. So it's not directly humanitarian, but it's answering a need both for the climate side, which is also it's also useful for us operating on the ground. So these are our areas, and then in the recent GCF board meeting, 2 more projects were approved with anticipatory actions and forecast-based financing elements in them. So I think it is getting there. Plus, of course, the mandate was given to the GCF to finance more loss and damage. And so this is really, I have a lot of faith in this pathway. Looking at these areas where the humanitarian, the disaster, the development, the DRR community, the climate community really converge. And it's that kind of mindset, the risk-informed, risk-centered kind of approach.
Just on the finance piece, because something that you said, Heba, I think is really important. Obviously, any loss and damage financing is going to be required across many, many different bases. And I think the humanitarian sector, as you pointed out, a small part of this should not be looking for a disproportionate part of that financing. But more importantly, I think that financing should not go to a sector as it is currently constructed, which is really good, really well designed to deal with the food insecurity situations of the 1980s. So that financing should only really be coming to humanitarians when humanitarians have shown that they are actually up for and working in the future. And a lot of that is about intermediation, to use that horrible word. Really, the people, the money should be going on the people who are showing that they know what to do. And my limited experience, I'm sure Donna has much more experience with this, is the people who at the moment are the experts in preparedness and response are communities. They're not necessarily, as we said, a lot of agencies are not there yet. And so it would be very worrying if money were being soaked up and wasn't getting where it could be most effective. My concern about anticipation is, whilst it works extremely well for things where the risks can be calculated, things that can be anticipated, I think there are demonstrably quite a number of things where that's not the case. And even some of the things that we're used to calculating, like hurricanes, cyclones, wildfires, and we can say how they will have been able to say in the past and predict how they will work. My understanding is that some of that prediction is becoming less and less effective. With the Australian wildfires, for example, with storms in the Caribbean, the amount of time is no longer 4 or 5 days, it's less than 24 hours. And so So there's a real challenge there. But also, of course, we all know that natural disasters are not necessarily crises. Crises are where the natural disaster integrates with the social, economic and political system. And that can be very, very hard, as we've seen with COVID. That can be very hard to anticipate, particularly when things are happening that haven't happened before. And so
it's those knock-on effects.
Knock-on effects. One big call I would make is for humanitarians to look, to really scrutinise what are the sorts of things where anticipation is a really good approach, and there are many, and what are the sorts of things we need to prepare for where anticipation will give us a false sense of security, and we need a different kind of, a more adaptive approach to those.
Anticipatory action, I agree, will not save all our problems, I think, but it is something that will allow us to do more. I think to save more lives and move people early on and all those things. So it is something that will add on to the long list of things that we are doing well to and doing together, with different actors, with different groups. And also what we're seeing in the Philippines is that unless it's really institutionalized and it's part of government system, anticipatory action will not be possible. Because we've had a lot of heartaches when we were doing anticipatory forecast-based financing only in small pockets of areas. And then suddenly the typhoon decided to go another way, and it was just impossible. We were I remember those days when cash transfers were just not yet accepted. I think this is what's happening with forecast-based financing and anticipatory action, because it's just being piloted here and there. Unless it's the system who will really adapt it, the humanitarian plus the government, I think it will not meet its full potential.
I think we'll know that things are more likely to work when the cultures that, we've all been part of sometimes of, this way, not that way, either or, it's either anticipation or it's response. It's either resilience or it's response. Those cultures do still exist in our business. Sure. It's either cash or, everything must be cash, or it's, no, it's always both and, exactly. It's always, we've always got to be humble enough to recognize that the other guys and women have got some pretty good ideas too.
Coming back to your point, Donna, earlier about we need to be building resilience today for the risks, not just of tomorrow, but well down the line. I don't quite see how humanitarians can do that when they're already so strapped. They can barely even respond to not even the risks of tomorrow, but the crises of today. How are they supposed to be able to then add to that this whole other portfolio of long-term resilience building? I think many would say that's not our job. We can't even do the limited response work that is our job, and now you're putting on us all of this kind of long-term resilience building. How do you see that working?
Well, first of all, I think we should also recognize that humanitarians are not the only ones doing the work. Your response operations is only as good as your level of preparedness, and your level of preparedness is only as good as your level of risk reduction, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to do work on it hand in hand. So those who are doing so we bring in the climate people and help us see the science, the risk, and all those things. Bring the DRR, the development, and we all work together. Okay, in response operations, here are our lessons: A, B, C, D. This did not work. This worked, etc. And then we plot it in a future scenario. Okay, I think this will not. So that calibrating, recalibrating, relearning, unlearning, etc. will be iterative and will continue. Because it's you're very correct. It's just impossible for one sector to just do all the thinking and do the planning. And of course, the most importantly, we need to bring the communities in the planning part of this, because some sectors feel that they need to teach communities. Actually, the communities know more. They know which cave to run to when there was I remember there was a story during Haiyan. We were doing immediately after Haiyan, we were talking with the communities who were first hit by the super typhoon, and those who were saved rushed to a specific cave that helped them survive, and so they have a lot of practices that we don't have, that probably don't fit to our global terminologies, but they work on the ground.
And of course, in the climate conversation, the they very quickly becomes we.
Totally.
As we've seen with COVID,
I agree.
We are the they. There's no this distinction between isn't there anymore, is it? And this is something I think that will actually, another of those kind of paradigms that we're used to is going to, depending on where we are in the world, is going to change very quickly. And when that changes, what else changes with it?
True.
I think COVID's been really interesting there. Actually, we've seen from COVID that it's down to each and everybody and the degree to which they wear a mask and the degree to which they're vaccinated and the degree to which they talk to their friends. That's brought home to us the realities of it was always about people, and then the technical and, the sort of the force maximizing aspect of the organization is not necessarily, is rather different from that we might think when we're sort of in the organization.
That message needs to resonate to everyone. It's a collective responsibility. We all have roles. We all have tasks to do. If we want to make this work, we really just need to work together.
And you've mentioned that a few times, Dawn, about kind of breaking up these silos and the need to have a platform that brings these different sectors together. You talked about learning and relearning. Paul, I wanted to hear from you about the Complex Humanitarian Crises Initiative, or CHC, that you're trying to get off the ground, because it aims to address really some of these challenges. Tell us about it.
Yes, this is something that I've become engaged in with a couple of colleagues, reaching out to humanitarian organisations, but critically not trying to make it a humanitarian club, but also to civil society organisations that are maybe engaged in humanitarian action, women's organisations, youth organisations, and private sector and climate academics as well, to really look at this element of the response part, when the anticipation, when the resilience, when the mitigation fails, what are agencies and going to do then, and what are we going to do for the most vulnerable. And I think what's developing from conversations that we're having with this broad stakeholder group is it would be very useful to many actors to collate all of the information that's available, to say exactly what is the nature of the things that we need to be prepared for. How often, where, when, because there's loads of great stuff out there, and just bringing it together for decision makers and agencies. So there's a kind of collation role. Secondly, there seems to be a lot of appetite for each individual organisation to then do what we were saying earlier and say, well, so what is our role going to be in this? Because maybe we need to move away from the humanitarian system back to organisations thinking what their particular response is. And so if this happens, what are we going to do as an agency? And agencies helping each other to do that is the second piece. And then thirdly, providing support to the change management that's required, because that will require, as we've said, conceptual changes, structural changes in the organisations to make them more agile and more localised, procedural changes as well. So what we're hoping to do in the CHC is to provide a platform, you talked about platform earlier, Donna, where agencies can collate the information, work with each other to come up with their own plan about how they're going to deal with this global crisis, and then support each other to make the changes that are going to be required to be the kind of organisations that can take part in that. So we're having great conversations, not a lot of donor funding yet, but great conversations, so watch this space.
On every episode, we try to release guests from the constraints of thinking within the current systems and frameworks and say, if you could wave your magic wand and kind of introduce an idea that would address all of the changes that you feel are necessary, all of the dysfunction, all of the lack of preparedness, what would be your $1 million, $1 trillion idea for the humanitarian sector, for the climate sector more broadly, as you wish? Donna?
My wish? Well, I think for us to just think, act, and work as people, as one. I think the biggest frustration right now is because the institutions, the mindsets are all just, you do this, I only do up to here, and that silo thing is just killing us. For me, I dream of a world when nobody will say, I'm a climate person, you're a response person, you're a DRR person, I'm a development person, and we have different tasks. I dream of a day when we all just say, come on, let's see what the problem is. Let's work with communities. Let's find ways to reduce our vulnerabilities, and let's find ways to be resilient together. I don't know if that dream will happen, though.
A utopian world indeed. Paul, what about you? What's your multi-million-dollar idea?
It's not multi-million, and it's not my idea, but it's my wish, and it actually, I think it's very close to what Donna was saying. I think my wish is that we have a Copernican revolution. We stop thinking that everything circles around us, and we recognise that we circle around it. So that going forward, humanitarians, we're all able to take a step back and recognise that we are a often small planet circling around a crisis, and there are many other planets circling around in different orbits around that solar system. We are not the sun. We're not at the centre of it. And I think what that would mean would be the first question we'd ask ourselves is not, what are we going to do? The first question we'd ask ourselves each and every time would be, where do we fit in? And in a way, it's kind of a little thing, but it might make a difference.
Thank you to both of you for beginning to outline what kind of rethinking is necessary if the humanitarian sector is to be equipped to deal with this massive threat barreling towards us. I think you've laid out a number of ways in which the sector will need to change in how it works with others, and how it thinks, as you've both said. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heba.
If you have thoughts on the role of humanitarians in climate change, tweet your comments or questions to us at CGDev and at NewHumanitarian with the hashtag RethinkingHumanitarianism. Or send us a voice recording. We love to have your voice on the podcast to rhpodcast@thenewhumanitarian.org. If you're a regular listener, we'd really appreciate you leaving a review of the podcast to help other people discover it. And as always, to learn more about the topics we tackle on the podcast, head to thenewhumanitarian.org or check out cgdev.org. Thank you for listening to Rethinking Humanitarianism. See you next time.